Pokemon Adventures has gained quite a notable following for debatably having some of the best narratives in the Pokemon franchise, and I know you guys have been asking me to do a video on it for a while, and I swear I'm going to get around to it eventually. I promise you that there is a Pokemon Adventures video in the works, but as you can tell by the title, this is not a Pokemon Adventures video. Instead, I'll be covering one of the other Pokemon manga, which there are a surprising amount of. There's the movie tie-ins, of course, because marketing, I guess. Another one that kind of follows the games, but not really, and is much more comedy-focused. Some of the spin-off games got brief adaptations. Diamond and Pearl got its own separate series for some reason. And then there's Pokemon Rebirth, which is basically Animorphs, but with Pokemon. And no, it's not as cool as it sounds, unfortunately. Today, however, I'll be covering a manga that's actually a loose adaptation of the TV series titled The Electric Tale of Pikachu. This brief 20-chapter series ran in an offshoot CoroCoro magazine in the late 90s and premiered the same month as Pokemon Adventures and the TV series. Like the anime, it follows Ash and his new Pikachu as they travel the Kanto region collecting the badges of gym leaders in order to qualify for the Pokemon League. And the series covers both the Indigo League and Orange Island sagas. However, as you might expect, this is a very different version of the Pokemon world than any iteration we've seen before or since. For starters, the aesthetic of the series has this retro sci-fi style that's totally unlike anything I've seen before in Pokemon. It reminds me a lot of Dragon Ball and all the capsule core tech that Bulma uses. In a weird way, the sci-fi setting kinda matches up with the concept of using advanced technology to tame Pokemon, but since Pokemon is fundamentally a fantasy series and tends to obey more fantasy tropes than sci-fi ones, it's still pretty jarring. Plus, it kinda gives up on this after a while to line up more with the anime, which is something I'll probably be saying a lot in this video. The concepts of Pokemon trainers and the Pokemon League are also radically different from other Pokemon stories. The rules and qualifications are much stricter here, and you actually have to be legally licensed as a Pokemon trainer if you even want to purchase a Pokeball. We also get some statistics about the qualification and retention rates for would-be trainers. Only about 20% of those who attempt to become pro trainers actually become pros, and only about 5% of that 20% can stick it out long enough to make a career out of it. Even the Pokemon themselves have different capture rankings, ranging from A to D, making the world feel even more structured and hierarchical. It feels like very rudimentary shonen world building, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but much like many other concepts that this manga brings up, it's not really addressed again in later chapters. The actual introduction to the world of Pokemon isn't exactly a strong one either. To introduce us properly to these mysterious and fantastical creatures, we're greeted with this massive text dump across a 2-page spread, and it's hardly an interesting read either. The first panel of this info dump literally reads, Pokemon, the name for a mysterious species not recorded in traditional biological taxonomies. It feels so dry and flat, like I'm reading a textbook or something, and it really doesn't work well in making Pokemon sound exciting. However, there is one new element in this series that I found pretty fascinating, the concept of school. Yes, there are actual non-Pokemon related schools in this world, something that even Pokemon Adventures doesn't mention. When a child turns 10, they have the option to take a leave of absence from school in order to pursue the Pokemon trainer lifestyle, though only for a brief period of time. If they can't qualify for the Pokemon League within a certain time frame, then they have to return to their studies. This is a pretty cool idea because it applies more pressure to Ash and his ability to succeed in his adventures. The threat of having to return to boring school life if he can't succeed makes each encounter feel much more exciting, especially when he fails. And knowing how slim the odds of him becoming a pro trainer are makes it all the more intense. Unfortunately, the ticking clock element kinda gets undone in Chapter 3 when he spends 3 whole weeks chasing a Clefairy. We also don't actually see Ash in school at all, so we don't feel the contrast between the doldrums of the classroom and the excitement of Pokemon training. On top of that, the info dump I mentioned earlier becomes even more tonally dissonant when you realize that the world Ash is escaping from school to explore is introduced in the most textbook, uninteresting manner possible. Perhaps that's the point and it's supposed to be like something Ash read in a textbook, but this is supposed to be the audience's introduction to Pokemon, so why on earth would you make it so boring? Getting back to the meat of things, the story itself is radically different from that of the TV series, and yet, at the same time, copies many different moments from the TV series almost line for line. In this story, Brock and Misty aren't regular traveling companions until 5 or 6 chapters in, and Ash just kinda does his own thing for a while before they return. Brock is only in view for about 1 or 2 pages before Ash easily beats him, and then we don't hear from him at all until chapter 4. He retains his flirtatious streak, but the wiser, more mentor-like personality is almost dropped completely, so he's not nearly as interesting. Misty, on the other hand, is way more stubborn and confrontational in this version, and almost feels like a legitimate rival to Ash at some points, and they play up the romantic subtext even more as well. Kind of unfortunate we only got brief teasers of that, but still fun nonetheless. Though I definitely wouldn't say that this is a good version of Misty because it totally removes all of the nuance from her character. Gone are the fascinating conflicts between traditional femininity and individual empowerment, or the innate motherly instinct that gives her so much depth. Here she's just a tomboy, and that hardly does the character justice. Which reminds me that I really need to finish that character analysis I've been working on, but that's for another video. Of course, most of this excessive simplicity is because the manga's only 20 chapters long as opposed to the 118 episodes of anime that it reflects, but I'd hardly call that an excuse either. The manga also has a very weird relationship with the anime in terms of what kind of content it covers and how it presents said content. Some chapters only make a few mild changes to the stories from the original anime, like Ash's gym battle with Misty, while others just take the basic premise of an anime episode and turn it into something else entirely, such as the Eevee brothers story being turned into this weird battle tower experience. And then there are the chapters that are just fucking insane, like how chapter 7 combines elements from 10 different episodes. It starts with Duplica doing a comedy act, and then we see brief shots of AJ from episode 8 and the samurai from episode 4. It translates what the Pokemon are saying, like in episode 17. They meet the abandoned Charmander from episode 11 and the Kangaskhan kid from episode 34. Team Rocket is kinda thrown in there even though this is their introduction to the series. They talk about Koga's ninja school and the Diglett that were interfering with the construction site, and all of this leads up to the abandoned Pokemon paradise from episode 10. The most unintentionally hilarious part though is that there's a little note at the end of a narration panel that straight up tells you to watch the TV series to find out more about some of these events. Like, really? You're just gonna plug the TV series because you don't want to expand on the topics you already brought up? Okay, I guess. The series also has its own version of Pikachu's Goodbye, and strangely enough, I think it's actually handled better than it was in the anime. I've already done an entire video on why that particular episode is awful, so I'll let that speak for itself so you can compare. In the manga, meanwhile, Pikachu ends up ignoring Ash entirely in favor of the wild Pikachu, and it actually feels like they might be growing apart, leading Ash to think that he should leave without his friend, only to be reunited again at the end, and not a single corny ballad montage in sight. The actual layout and paneling of the manga is also a bit odd, much different from that of Adventures. Many times a page will be focused entirely around one specific drawing of a character that's brought to the forefront, often laying on top of other panels. It reminds me a lot of how Yoshihiro Togashi would construct panels for Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter, where the emotion of each page is centered around the highlighted character, and it actually works pretty well in some instances. On the whole, however, it's mostly just used as an accent to mark the entry of new characters, so it gets a bit tedious over time. Plus, the oversized drawings often make the rest of the page feel cramped and more difficult to navigate, so it really does a number on the overall flow and pacing of the series. The Pokemon battles are pretty okay, but not really worthy of note, save for perhaps Ash's battle with Richie in the Pokemon League, which turns into an epic Charizard v Charizard face-off that gets way more intense and bloody than I had expected. The art itself is also a radical departure from the rest of the series. Everything about these character designs screams 1990s, but I kinda like it that way. Sure, there are some moments where they go way too far and it just looks kinda goofy, but the series definitely has its own look and doesn't really feel too derivative in regards to other entries in the franchise. There's also just a lot of really weird and kind of disturbing imagery as well. Chapter 4 in particular really goes all out on making the ghost Pokemon unnecessarily terrifying and unnerving. And when a Pokemon isn't meant to look overly cute, they run it all the way to the other end of the spectrum and get as realistic as possible. Unfortunately, much like the rest of the franchise, the Electric Tail of Pikachu was often on the receiving end of censorship from publishers and licensors, and this particular entry into the Pokeverse is probably the most censored one of the bunch due to its original iteration having an excessive amount of sexual content, which really isn't all that surprising since the author, Toshihiro Ono, is much better known for his work on hentai manga, and it really shows in Electric Tail. If I had grown up with this version of Misty's character model instead of the anime version, I think my childhood would have been quite a bit different. It got so ecchi in some places that the last two panels of Chapter 6 were cut entirely from the English release. Usually I'm a huge detractor of licensing censorship because it takes away from the original vision of the work, but it's pretty clear that there's no way Viz could have sold this to their younger readers as it was. As for the manga's conclusion, well, I honestly don't know. While the series was fully released physically by Viz back in the late 90s and early 2000s, the series has long been out of print, and there doesn't seem to be a completed scanlation version anywhere online. I cannot find translated copies of chapters 17, 18, or 20 anywhere. Only the raw, untranslated scans. The final volume of the series is still available from third-party sellers, but there's no way I'm paying 3 figures for a volume of a series that I don't really think is all that good anyway. Also, if you plan on buying for yourself, don't be fooled by the plethora of different entries on Amazon. This is what the cover of the complete Volume 4 looks like, while these are just individual chapters. Yes, they actually sold individual chapters as comic book style stories at one point, and apparently they were originally $2.95 a piece. The early manga licensing industry was kinda weird. If you find yourself Nippon savvy enough though, then I, as would many others, would be extremely grateful if you translated these chapters for me just so I know how everything ends. But from what I can gather, chapters 17 and 18 cover Ash's battle with Drake in the Orange Islands League, while chapter 20 is basically an epilogue via a letter Ash sends home to his mom. But the most interesting thing about this last chapter, aside from this tiny panel over here that kinda hints at an implied physical relationship between Ash and Misty, is that it confirms a canon relationship between Jesse and James by having them get married. I have no idea why, but that's a thing, much like many other things in this manga. In the end, it's not hard to see why this series was so short and got so little notice, as it's very much a below average presentation of the Pokemon world. It does have some bright spots now and then, but most of it is overshadowed by all the moments where it fails. Sure, it's only 20 chapters, but short lengths have never really stopped me from dropping stuff before, and I definitely would not have read so much of this series if I wasn't going to make a video about it. It was fun to learn about this part of Pokemon's past, but the past is definitely where it should stay. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm sorry about the past couple weeks of irregular uploads and stuff, but the summer is finally here, and I have my whole schedule open for at least 2 months, so I'm really gonna try and go all out with these videos. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more, be sure to like and subscribe so you can stay up to date on all my latest content. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rourke Tenjoin, Kushina Minami, Christine Seibert, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.